Hello, everybody, and welcome to yet another student-produced Reading Through History knockoff video. My name is Carolyn Tao, and I am a student currently enrolled in Mr. Peter Paccone's San Marino High School APUSH history class. The focus of today's video is the Transatlantic Slave Trade. Today, we will be discussing the APUSH Key Concepts section 1.2. European traders partnered with some African groups who practiced slavery to forcibly extract slave labor for the Americas. The Spanish imported enslaved Africans to labor in plantation agriculture and mining. We will be discussing why and how 10 million slaves were shipped from Africa to do work in the Americas. We will also be discussing the Middle Passage as well as some short and lasting impacts the slave trade had on the world. Now, let's start from the beginning. Before the transatlantic slave trade, European colonists migrated to the New World. The exploration of the Americas generated intense social, religious, political, and economic competition and changes. Communicable diseases such as smallpox were also a byproduct of the exchange. Due to these diseases brought from the colonists, 90% of Native Americans died, and therefore, the Europeans turned to African slaves to serve for labor. The Atlantic slave trade was a segment of global trade that transported 10 million to 12 million enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas from the 16th to 19th century. Portugal was the first country to initiate and participate in the slave trade. However, this human trafficking spanned mainly across three continents: Africa, South America, and North America. Less than 4% of the total came to North America, and 1725 to 1825 marked the high watermark of the transatlantic slave trade. Once the ships made it to the New World, most slaves transported to North America ended up working for plantations in southern colonies. Most slaves were sent from Central and Western Africa. Their journey to North America was known as the Middle Passage, or a part of the trade where Africans were densely packed onto ships. The slaves were chained and marched to slave forts on the coast, shaved to prevent lice, branded, then loaded onto ships bound for the Americas. Because of the dreadful conditions aboard the ship, including captains who crammed as many men as possible below deck and the lack of sanitation, many people contracted diseases and died during transportation. This was about 14%. Others were thrown overboard for being sick or punished for participating in insurrection and used as an example to discipline the others. Women and children that were loaded aboard the ships were kept above deck and abused by crew. They were forced to dance in order to keep them exercised and suppress rebellion. Some captains even cut off slaves' ears as proof of purchase to ensure their profits. The need for slaves started because most crops grown in the new colonies, for example, sugarcane, tobacco, and cotton, were labor intensive. Europeans looked into Africa since the Native Americans died out. The Europeans offered manufactured goods, weapons, and rum for slaves. Therefore, African kings and merchants did not resist, as they viewed the people sold as criminals, debtors, or prisoners of war from rival tribes. The kings would benefit from the trafficking as their communities and realms would be enriched in comparison to neighboring enemies. Now, for a quick story. Many Africans were taken from their homeland, and they lacked clear records because the superior whites believed that African slaves were less than people. As a result, present-day African Americans find it difficult to trace back their heritage, except for the descendants of one girl, Priscilla. 250 years ago, according to the National Geographic, Priscilla was only 10 years old when she was kidnapped and transported to South Carolina. Unlike the ancestors of many African Americans, Priscilla left a paper trail to allow her descendants to trace themselves back to her. These records included ship logs, financial accounts, and plantation records. This has allowed Priscilla's seventh-generation daughter, Kaitlyn Martin Polite, to reunite with other descendants during a celebration in 2005. These ship records allow us to know that Priscilla was aboard a Newport, Rhode Island-based ship that went along the coast of Africa collecting slaves. She was taken to Ball's Comington plantation where she lived the rest of her life. Priscilla's story has been told over numerous of projects in hopes of raising awareness and the fact that northern states did play a role in slavery. It is a common misconception that the South was the villain in the transatlantic slave trade. However, northern states were not innocent of this cruelty. Rhode Island was one of the northern states that contributed to the captivity of African slaves. Newport was one of the major ports in the colonial times for the industry of African captivity. More than 900 ship voyages originated from Rhode Island and made the trip to Africa, ultimately delivered an estimated 100,000 slaves into the West Indies and North America. The transatlantic slave trade has greatly impacted the New World. Here are some short-term effects. The importation of slaves in the Americas developed many slave-based economies, including the plantation system. Slaves became the core group of labor in the following decades. As a result, the British economy and government flourished. British consumers were able to purchase cheap goods, while the American economy heavily relied on trade, becoming an export for British manufacturers. Because of the trade, diseases brought to the Americas destroyed populations, resulting in a shortage of labor and trailing back to the need for slaves. Additionally, here are some long-term effects. The arrival of African culture through slaves changed Northern American patterns for settlement, music, and language, as well as European goods introduced to Africa. There were also a spread of customs. The increased competition and arrival of European weapons fueled warfare and instability that is still going on today. The human trafficking also has led to the development of the racist ideology. Most African slavery occurred as a result of legal punishment or intertribal warfare. However, Europeans often preached a universal religion and outlawed enslaving fellow Christians, needed an explanation for their practice, and contradicted the ideals of equality that were taught. Their justification was that Africans were biologically inferior. With this premise, slavery in Europe and Americas established a racial bias, which made it impossible for slaves and their future descendants to attain an equal status in society compared to white people. Thanks for listening to our Reading Through History. Come back next time for more information about our history of the United States.